Hello everyone, I'm Anish Giri and I'm going to record a video for you for the magazine New in Chess, to which I'm a contributing editor of. And for this time I decided to have a look at a very old game of mine, a very memorable one too. I played against Illya Nyzhnyk back in 2008 when we both were little kids. I believe I was something like 14 and 13 probably, and he was a couple years younger. But already he was a very strong player, 2400. Now he is a grandmaster. But look, let's start with the game. The game was very exciting. So in the game, Ilya started with the d4. A positional player as he usually played this move. And I decided to surprise him because I used to play the King's Indian during those times, which is characterized by the move g6, when the bishop develops to g7. And later, in the main line, the bishop actually closes itself after the move e5 by the pawn. So for that game, I prepared a different variations, which is the Benoni, which is similar to the King's Indian. The bishop also goes to the long diagonal, but black starts with the move c5 here. And the idea is that now the long diagonal is going to be open, and then after the bishop gets to g7, it's going to control the long diagonal. So as you can see, the openings are quite similar, but also a little different. Ilya was playing the main line, which is characterized by the moves knight c3, and then later white will go e4, knight f3, knight d2. And okay, let's make it clear. And then knight goes to c4, from where it attacks the pawn on d6. Here white can start with the move e4, which is much more logical. You basically open your bishop, but then black might pin the knight on f3 and exchange the two pieces, which is generally a good thing for him in the Benoni. So he started with knight d2, avoiding the pin. I played the logical move bishop g7, e4 castle, bishop e2, rook e8, rook goes on the semi-open file, attacking the e4 pawn. Actually, this e4 pawn is going to become a source of counterplay for black. Castle and a6. This is a common move in the Benoni. Black is trying to take some space on the queen side with the move b5. The other way to develop your pieces is to start by playing knight to a6, and then later to put the knight on c7, which will prepare the move b5, which is also possible, but it's an entirely different variation. The other line is knight d7, and that's the move I played in the game. The knight is usually heading for e5, from where it can sometimes go to g4, or maybe support the pawn advance with c4. And okay, here white has quite a broad choice. I believe it's possible to play f4 at some point, and then black might play c4, sacrificing a pawn. Knight will go to c5 and generate some counterplay against the e4 pawn. But Ilya was hesitating to play such committal move like f4, and he was playing it slowly. After rook e1, I can already play knight to e5, which is a very active move. The knight is, well, opening the way for the bishop, which will probably go to d7, preparing the move b5. Also, possibly at some point c4 will happen, but black has to watch out that white is not going to kick the knight back with f4. After f4, here black can go knight g4. Now, okay, if you chase the knight, it's going to attack the queen from here. So logical is to start with bishop f3, and then there are some typical ideas of sacrifices. For example, h5, h3, knight takes d5, and the bishop opens, and the queen opens as well. And after knight takes d5, bishop d4 check. If the king goes to h1, there is knight f2 check, winning the queen because it's a double attack. And if king f1, then queen h4, threatening mate in 1. Possibly check on h2 is going to be a threat too. So this leads to a lot of counterplay for black. So it was possible to play knight e5. But instead of f4, white might have played h3 first, stopping knight g4, and then threatening f4. But okay, I played rook b8. White kept on waiting, queen c2. Now I played knight e5. Here f4 is a clear mistake because of the knight g4, like in the other line. h3, h3, knight e3 is still there. So white prevented that by playing h3. And here white wants to push the knight back with the move f4. And black has to basically do something. If he's going to, well, to make, let's say, waiting move, b6, white will kick the knight back to d7, and he will take space and win some tempo. That's not very promising. So here black has to basically decide how to prevent the move f4. One typical way is to sacrifice the pawn with c4. If f4, knight d3 gives some compensation, but knight takes c4 is going to, well, it's going to cost a pawn and probably compensation. It's not enough, although black will have the c file later on and some pressure. But another way is to play knight h5, which is very interesting. It's somewhat an anti-positional move because black doubles his pawn, but light square bishop is important, and black is going to maybe aim for the move f5 later on. So that was possible. And the other common idea I was played in the game is to play g5. You take control of the f4 square, you give up the control of the f5 square. So black is fighting for the dark squares, and white in return gets the light squares. So white played knight f1. This is a very typical move. The knight is heading towards the f5 square, either to g3 or to e3. And here, the pawn on g5 is attacked, this one. And I could play g4, which gives a lot of counterplay. For example, well, if you go h4, then knight h5, attacking this pawn. If g3, then probably queen f6, followed by knight f3 check, and a lot of counterplay. And if hg4, I'm going to take back. Now the queen is going to enjoy this diagonal, so white probably has to kick the knight back, and then black goes to h6, which is a very, very strong idea. And now the threat is to go f5. As you can see, black has pushed his pawns from his king, but thanks to the bishop on g7, the king is quite safe on g8. And well, if white plays bishop e3, f5, black gets a lot of counterplay. And if white is going to prevent the advance with f5, black is just going to, at some point, he's just going to sacrifice on g4 the piece, and then rook will go to the open file, and there will be some dangerous attack. So it was quite possible to play g4 right away, but I played h6, which is somewhat of a waiting move. Now white could play f4, exchanging these pawns, but I would still have a strong outpost on the e5 square. White would have the f file, so probably now I would prefer white's position. He will go knight g3, rook to f1, maybe he will double on the f file and put some pressure. And probably this knight on e5 is more beautiful than it actually is, but okay, black is going to play bishop d7. Well, a typical plan to advance the queen side. The position is going to be unclear. Illya played knight g3. Well, the knight controls these two squares. White possibly would like to go also knight d1, knight e3, and then jump to f5. And here I took some action. I went g4. Now taking is even worse, because after knight fg4, f3, queen h4, I'm threatening the knight and some unpleasant checks. Also note that this diagonal is weakened. So at some point the bishop is going to come there. So after g4, Illya kept the position closed with h4. Now I went knight h7, attacking this pawn. It was actually possible to sacrifice it, for example, with knight d1. But okay, it's a pity to give up a pawn. So he went h5, queen h4, and now he went for the knight d1. And well, if white is going to be given two moves, he's going to play knight e3, and then knight f5. And well, once the knight is on f5, it's going to attack the d6 pawn, the g7 bishop, and black's position will collapse. So I played knight g5, which is a very aggressive move. I think I was intending to go knight ef3 check, sacrificing a piece, and then, well, let's just see what's going to happen. For example, bishop d2, knight f3, gf3, maybe gf3, and you know, bishop might come to e5, and white king is in somewhat of a mating net here. thanks to the strong pawn on f3. So here Illya just took this knight, which is a very safe choice, but it's a big pity because this bishop on g7 is very strong. And once this c1 bishop is gone, then it's really dominating the dark squares. Another way was to play rook a3. It would control the f3 square, but after b5, well, eventually probably white will have to take on g5 anyway, because if he goes knight e3, they will follow the mentioned idea of knight f3 check. So this trade happened, and here, okay, white is basically having control of the f5 square, but at least I have the dark squares. I played bishop d7. I could play also b5. I wasn't sure whether I really want to push these pawns. Usually these pawns, you know, pawn goes to b4, attacks the knight on c3, but knight is already gone from c3. I'm not sure how efficient this is, and also I decided to wait a little bit. Maybe now I would, maybe I would like to, let's say after some move, or let's make a random move. Maybe I would like to take on b5 with the bishop and have the b file open. I'm not sure. Here I believe Illya made a mistake. He played a5. It's always a choice in the Benoni, in this kind of structures, when black is ready to play b5, whether white should allow it and then take on b5, or white should play a5. Essentially, this move doesn't really close the b file, so in this particular case, it's not very helpful. After b5, as you can see, the rook got very active, and already there is a threat of rook takes b2. As you can see in the game, after he took on a6, I took on b2, and the rook was impossible to recapture because of the knight f3 check, and the bishop is going to take the queen. So here, well, Illya did take the pawn, but maybe it was, well, definitely it was better to play b3 to prevent this, this idea of rook takes b2. And now there are some complications. For example, rook b8, attacking this pawn. Pawn is going to be protected. And then there are some ideas like knight f3. It's a check. Then knight is going to be captured. Then pawn is captured back. And then rook is captured. And, well, along the third rank, there is a lot of pieces hanging here. And the position is very complicated. I believe objectively it's quite balanced. But that was better than the game, because in the game I got my rook quite active. And you can already see that this f2 square is a little bit under some sort of attack potentially. But okay, right now black has to deal with the weak pawn on d6. That's the usual worry of the Benoni player. And here I made a move which is always a pity to make. I played bishop f8, protecting this pawn. I'm not sure it was a good move, because it's a really pity to remove the bishop from the diagonal from the long diagonal. I could instead sacrifice the pawn. And if he would take it, I could play queen f4. And now I am threatening to go knight f3 check, because the rook would hang on d6. And if the rook would go back, I could play rook b3, and then there is a threat of rook takes b3. The bishop cannot move because the f2 pawn is attacked twice. So essentially white is pinned, and this d6 pawn which is gone is not really felt. So I could have sacrificed it now, but I played bishop f8, which is a fine move. It's quite safe. Well, we repeated the moves for once. I don't know what was the point basically of, but okay, why not? And here I decided to play for a win, because I thought my position is quite comfortable. Actually, I remember that Illya, he was very open about his views. He was showing his emotions, and I remember he looked extremely confident, and it was quite confusing for me because I was very happy about my position, and he looked also happy, and whenever I would make a move, he would frown, and he would be like, what kind of move you made? So I thought, well, I was quite confused, but finally I decided to trust my judgment and play for a win. And here, Illya made a mistake. He exchanged the knights, strong knight on e5. But that weakened this f2 square, which I was talking about. Instead, he should have kept the tension and maybe played queen c1. reinforcing this e3 square. I don't know, I believe black has a comfortable position, but it's still early to make any conclusions. He played knight c4, and here I made a very strong move that I'm quite proud of. Actually, the bishop is hanging now in d7, as you can see. And normal move would be to play, I don't know, bishop c8 or bishop e8. Then my plan would possibly be to go bishop g7, followed by bishop d4, pressing on the f2 square. But when you play a move like bishop e8, you give your opponent some time. For example, oh, maybe a move like e5 is possible, and then, well, knight would go to e4. Maybe with some counterplay, because the rook is quite active here. I don't know, the pawn on g4 is a little weak. Instead, I decided to solve the problem in a very radical way. I just gave up the bishop on d7, which seems a little insane, but after rook takes d7, which was played, I took on f2. And now you can see that the bishop actually has quite a lot of potential on g7. It just goes to d4, and if white were to recapture the rook, after bishop d4 check, white would have to give up the queen for the bishop, because if he's going to play king f1, it's just going to be mate. Well, simple as that, for example. So here, suddenly the white's position collapsed, and not only, well, there is no direct threat at the moment, but rook b2 is coming. Bishop might come to e5 or to d4. And, well, the king is basically in quite some trouble. The best would probably be to take on f2, bishop d4, queen takes d4. And then white has a rook and knight and the bishop for the queen, which is a good deal for him. But unfortunately for him, there is a threat of queen f4, and this knight on g3 is weak. And white's position is collapsing. I believe after a move like king g1, stopping queen f4, black is going to play queen h4, attacking the weak knight, king f2, and now, well, I think the easiest is to play just rook c8, attacks this bishop. If the bishop moves, the rook is going to enter, and the bishop is attacked after rook d1, probably move like queen g5, and then the queen is entering here, and the bishop is weak, the knight is weak. The rook on d7 is actually doing nothing. It would have done a better job had it stood somewhere on e2. So material here is fine for white, but his position is just collapsing. Instead, Illya tried e5 here, which is, well, it's a desperate attempt to close the bishop on g7. But it doesn't really work. I just took, well, I played rook b2 first, important move. Now the rooks are connected, they attack g2, bishop f1, and now I just took on e5. And once again, the bishop is a very powerful piece. It's also going to, I mean, it might go to d4, and white has no counterplay. The bishop could have been taken. I would reply with d knight e4. Well, it's a double attack, but it's not very efficient after queen f4. If you take back, I'll give two checks, and after g3, the threat of queen h2 is deadly. So Illya didn't take the bishop. He played rook e4, attacking the g4 pawn. But after simple rook f4, this, I'm going to exchange this rook, and the bishop once again is dominating the dark squares, and the king is under mating attack. Finally, Illya gave the exchange anyway, but here already black has a rook and two pawns for two pieces, which is already a good thing, but also the king once again is weak, and once again this g3 knight has nobody to guard it. Illya played queen d3, and now a very efficient and strong move is rook f3. And queen is attacked, and if you're going to take the rook, then queen g3 leads to mate. So after rook f3, basically white has already completely lost, and Illya made two more moves. And I just captured the knight, and he basically resigned. His position is hopeless, and also black has a lot of material up. So that was the game, and I remember I was quite proud of this idea. For example, starting with the move g5, which looks very, very risky and daring, but which is obviously not my idea. I think it was the idea of Fischer, but probably he also copied it from somewhere. And then especially, of course, the piece sacrifice, which was actually not needed. This is always more difficult later on here. When you don't need to sacrifice a piece, you can just play a normal move and to sacrifice it anyway. This I was quite happy about. And you can also imagine how this position looks if you're black. Let's turn the board around, which definitely makes the whole thing much more pleasant. And now you can see basically the amount of pleasure I had when I executed my last two moves here. Well, I don't know if you feel the same pleasure or not. I hope you do. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this game as much as I enjoyed playing it, and I hope you learned something. Thank you.